10 stupid things to do on the brink of life and death. On the car ride with my grandfather, I was full of questions as usual. This time I had a not-so-serious thought. I decided it was time to figure out why dogs like to stick their heads out of windows so much. They seem to enjoy it, and I've always wondered what it is about it that attracts them. Maybe the wind, maybe the smells, maybe something else. Anyway, I stuck my head out the window, hoping to feel what they were feeling. But just as I felt the wind begin to play with my hair, the cabin suddenly felt cold. Grandpa, who had always been a bit predictable in his actions, suddenly decided that the window should be closed. He pressed the power window button, and the glass began to move slowly upward, ignoring my head, which was still sticking out of the window. Before I could even realize anything, I was left in a position where the glass was starting to rise, and I was between him and the glass. "It hurts! Stop!" I shouted out, feeling the glass gradually press down on my neck. Grandfather didn't realize at first what was happening. His look was full of bewilderment. He didn't immediately realize that I was trapped and kept saying something inaudible. I tried to break free, but the glass was almost at the top. Finally, the glass stopped, and my grandfather, realizing his mistake, put it down with difficulty. But it was too late. There was a painful blue streak on his neck, which takes a long time to heal and reminds me of that moment. I really didn't understand what dogs find in it. Maybe the wind is really so special. But I wasn't particularly interested before that anymore. And so story number 2, Texas. It's a summer day. The sun is blazing. The heat is so hot that the air feels like it's melting. My friends and I wandered into a water park that we've been meaning to go to since we were kids. At times like this, you usually want to experience something extreme, something that will make your heart beat faster. And of course, I was no exception. I was a cocky 18-year-old at the time who thought I was up for any challenge. When I saw the slide standing like a monument against the clear sky, I couldn't resist. The slide looked like something out of a nightmare. But it had its own appeal. It was almost vertical, with an eerie solid drop, as if someone had just taken and carved out a piece of rock. It was about 30 meters high, and there was concrete at the bottom, though it was covered in water, which promised some not-so-pleasant consequences if you fell. Signs warned not to push off before descending, but I didn't give a damn. I was young, confident, thought I could control it. I stood at the top with an army of people below, some laughing, some just watching, but I could feel them all waiting for me to do something epic. And then the thought occurred to me, what if I do a jump right before I go down, just to get me up to speed? I couldn't just sit on an inflatable lap and slide down like a normal mortal, could I? I jumped up, and the moment my feet came off the platform, the whole crazy scene went down. All I could feel was the air hitting my face, and the moment I realized I'd been in the air too long. Yes, I didn't just jump. I flew up. I felt like I was floating like some kind of acrobat. And like a slow-motion movie, everything around me was getting fuzzy, but I was sure I was going to land right on the slide. The height. My head was somewhere below, and my feet were in the air, and I began to feel myself speeding up, the ground rushing towards me at an unprecedented speed. Time slowed down, and now I'm pretty sure I'm not going to make it to the slide in time. The next moment I'm in the air, the fall must be inevitable. I'm going to fly past and crash into the concrete. It doesn't seem scary, but it's really creepy. I could see the ground meet my gaze, and for a moment, it looks like I'm going to be somewhere I shouldn't be. But then a miracle happened. Somehow, I miraculously flew down the slide without tearing it apart. I even felt how hard I was pressed into the smooth plastic, but I went down at breakneck speed, according to all the laws of water parks. I didn't even immediately realize what had happened. I just rolled down, picking up speed like a normal person watching their life on a slide like that. My friend, who was on the same ride, looked at the whole thing with an expression of horror on his face. He later admitted that at that moment he realistically thought I was going to fall past the slide and crash. He was sure I wouldn't survive the fall. I also thought I was going to die. But I didn't actually die. I just landed. As strange as it sounds, I was still alive after all. After the descent, when I almost fell out onto the fin, I found out that there was a net strung at the bottom of the slide for idiots like me. Once safe, I replayed the moment in my head a few more times. I should have thought 100 times before I jumped. But I didn't think it would be like this. Even now, I'm not sure how lucky I was. But the lesson was learned. Sometimes it's better to just obey the sign and not try to show off, because not always extreme ends beautifully. And so, well, on to the third story. Winter. Vacation. Like all teenagers, I longed to get away from home, get a change of scenery, and see a friend I hadn't seen in a long time. It was going to be a great day. I was going to spend the night at his place and then come home the next night. A simple, well-thought-out trip. The journey was a long one. Buses, transfers, cold stops. I got to his place in the city already exhausted, but my spirits were still high. It was winter, freezing, only -12, but I was lightly dressed. I had only a couple of changes of clothes in my bag because I was going to stay with a friend, not in a hotel. And here I am standing on the doorstep. My heart was beating joyfully. Now he would open the door, we would drink tea, talk, laugh. But instead it was his mother who opened the door. She was thin, anxious, with a hard look in her eyes. She looked at me as if I had come with some sinister intent. "No, I won't," she said before I could say hello. I froze. I tried to explain that I was a friend of her son's, that we had an agreement, but it was no use. She was ironclad. She wouldn't even let me in, let alone sleep over. Only later did I learn that she suffered from a mental disorder. That's when I stood on her porch, feeling the cold slowly creeping into my body. A friend, as luck would have it, was somewhere in town, unavailable. There was no point in going to my mother again, and no strength. It was starting to get dark outside, and I was in an unfamiliar city, in light clothes, hungry, and with no idea where to go. A park bench. It was cold, freezing cold, but at that moment it was the only place I could catch my breath. I sat down, wrapping my arms around myself, trying to keep warm. Hunger and fatigue were doing their thing. At some point I just fell asleep. I woke up to a light tap on my shoulder. In front of me stood a man about 40 years old in a warm jacket with kind eyes. He turned out to be a cab driver. "What are you doing here?" "You'll freeze," he said, handing me a mug of hot coffee. At that moment, it was the best drink of my life. I couldn't immediately explain what had happened. My frozen lips could barely move. My voice shook. He didn't question me for long. He just nodded at his car. "Come on, don't freeze out here." I sat in the back seat, wrapped myself in some plaid he'd found in the trunk. He drove me around the city all night. Sometimes we'd stop and he'd silently pour me more coffee. I hardly spoke. I didn't have the energy. He didn't ask any questions either, as if he understood that the most important thing for me was simply to survive in this cold. By morning, he drove me to the station. Before I got out, he slipped some money into my hand. "For breakfast, kid, and have a safe trip." I sat at the train station, barely holding a hot bun in my hands, and I couldn't believe what had happened. This man, a complete stranger to me, had saved me without asking for anything in return. I don't think I would have survived that night if it wasn't for him. Now every time I see a cab driver, I think of him. People can be real angels sometimes. Let's move on to the fourth story. And so, the hurricane caught me at the worst possible moment on the highway. It was raining as if the heavens had decided to pour all the water on the earth at once. The wind was hitting the car as if it were trying to turn it over, and the road was disappearing underwater before my eyes. You could hardly distinguish where the asphalt ended and the chaos began. But I had no choice. I had to keep going. To the right and left, cars began to stall. Some just disappeared under the water like sinking ships. People were jumping out of them. Some were trying to push. Some were just standing there in shock, not knowing what to do. It was a nightmare in real time. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the water pushing the car sideways, and prayed to myself that I could somehow get out. And then I spotted the truck. Huge, powerful, it was moving forward as if it were punching its way through a wall of water. In front of it, the water dissipated, leaving behind it a kind of corridor, a fairway. I decided to take a risk. I stepped on the gas and pulled in right behind him, almost right up to him. He was my last hope. It was a scary ride. Visibility was nil. The sound of rain and wind drowned out even my own thoughts. Every time the truck slowed down a little or changed its trajectory, I could feel my car losing stability. I kept repeating only one thing, just to hold on, just to keep up. The wind tried to push me off the road, the water whipping against my sides, but I kept going. The truck seemed to guide me like a guiding star. At some point, we reached a junction. The truck started going up the slope, and I followed. When I got to the high ground, I breathed freely for the first time in all this hell. The water didn't reach the road here, and I realized I was saved. I stopped, looked down, and saw the raging torrent continuing to flood the highway. The cars that were there were no longer moving. Some people were not visible at all. I later learned that there had been casualties on that stretch of highway. Some didn't make it out in time. Some stayed in their cars, hoping the water would recede. I was lucky. But this hurricane was a reminder to me how thin the line between life and death is. Sometimes fate hinges on a simple decision to get behind a truck and go all the way. Let's go to the extreme fifth story. I was driving down the highway at night. Fatigue was setting in by the minute. My eyes were closing, but I thought I could make it to my destination. Wrong. At some point, I just passed out. I woke up from a sharp jolt. The car was shaking, and there was an oncoming lane in front of me. For a moment, everything went cold inside. I was on the oncoming lane. Fortunately, the road was empty, and I didn't hit anyone in the forehead. My heart was pounding like crazy. I quickly returned to my lane, stopped on the side of the road, and just sat there, realizing that I had almost endangered myself and others. Since then, if I feel I'm about to fall asleep, I immediately pull over to the side of the road, set an alarm clock, and sleep for half an hour. This rule saves my life. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel. There are a lot of interesting stories waiting for you.